The first time Celeste Whitaker locked eyes with Jason, it was like the world paused, not because the air shimmered with romance or because of some cinematic fairy tale script, but because something in her instinct paused and whispered, this one could change everything. It was day 2 of the North American Systems Engineering Conference in San Francisco, and Celeste had just concluded her paper on predictive data structures for cognitive rehabilitation. Her palms were still slightly damp from nerves when Jason approached, smiling with that casual arrogance that made it hard to tell if he was charming or dangerous. He was a financial strategist from New York, flown in to give a talk on entrepreneurial capital trends in the tech sector. Tall, immaculately dressed, confident in ways that made weaker men seem invisible. He listened to her presentation and followed her into the lobby afterward with a cup of chai latte she hadn't asked for. For the brilliant mind who made everyone in that room feel dumb, he joked, his voice smooth as glass. Celeste, who was used to people patronizing or overlooking her quiet intellect, couldn't help but smile, but there was caution hidden in the corners of her gaze. Still, something about the way he leaned in when she spoke, the way he remembered lines from her thesis, began melting her usual walls. The conference became their first shared memory, one filled with late-night room service debates, laughter over spreadsheets, and a final rooftop dinner overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge where he boldly asked for her number, and got it. Long distance between Boston and New York was never easy, but Jason made it seem effortless at first. Weekly video calls turned into daily check-ins. He'd visit her once a month, sometimes surprising her with business-class tickets to Manhattan for the weekend or flowers delivered to her office with obscure financial jokes only she would understand. Celeste, who had always buried herself in work and dismissed romance as a distraction, found herself watching her phone light up with anticipation. She'd never felt so seen before. Jason asked about her dreams, not just her job. He wanted to know about her grandmother's stroke, about the frustration that shaped Celeste's desire to revolutionize neurosoftware. He pretended to understand every algorithm and nodded thoughtfully even when he clearly didn't. Her friends, especially Mira, were cautious. Mira, a nurse with a past built on scars and survival, told her, "He's smooth, Cell. Just don't let smoothness blind you." But love, especially for someone who'd gone years without being touched by it, was intoxicating. Celeste was falling, not fast, but steadily, like a river carving through stone, slow but irreversible. On her 31st birthday, Jason showed up in Boston unexpectedly, dressed in a navy overcoat and holding a small black velvet box. Her colleagues were still clapping from the celebration lunch when he walked into the hallway of her office, got down on one knee, and asked her to marry him in front of everyone. That moment sealed her fate. The entire room cheered as if they were in a movie. Mira, standing to the side with folded arms, gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Celeste, overwhelmed and dazed by the attention, said yes. The proposal was viral-worthy. Someone posted a short video on LinkedIn, which Jason proudly reposted with the caption, "When brains and heart collide, you get forever." It got thousands of likes. But that was the beginning of Jason's taste for public admiration. Over the following months, Celeste noticed subtle shifts, how Jason always wanted their moments shared, not savored. How every gift came with a camera, every romantic gesture with a hashtag. But she convinced herself that modern love was loud and visible, not quiet and sacred. She'd never been the center of anyone's attention before, so she drank it all in like water in a desert. Planning the wedding was quick. Jason said he couldn't wait. Within 4 months, they were married on a cliffside in Vermont, with just 30 guests, soft music, and an elegant setup Jason's publicist arranged. Celeste's gown was classic ivory, but what stole the moment was the look in her eyes, pure belief that she'd found the one. If only she knew that the man beside her was not looking at her heart, but at his reflection in her admiration. That morning, when she woke next to him for the first time as a wife, she whispered, "We're forever now, right?" Jason kissed her temple, pulled her close, and replied, "Forever, my love." But his eyes were already wandering toward a future she couldn't yet see. Celeste Whitaker had never grown up believing in fairy tales. Her childhood was colored by emotional distance, muted dinner tables, and the sound of ticking clocks in a house that echoed more with silence than laughter. Her father, Richard, was a quiet man who believed emotions were signs of weakness, while her mother, Lorraine, was a high-level insurance executive whose ambition never made room for bedtime stories or Sunday hugs. From a young age, Celeste found solace not in people but in logic, puzzles, computers, simulations. She built her first basic software program at 10, attempting to mimic her grandmother's speech pattern after her first stroke. When her grandmother passed from a second one, Celeste vowed to build something, anything, that could give others what her family lost: understanding, communication, dignity. That vow became her obsession, her career, and her identity. She was the kind of woman who lived with purpose, but not much emotional armor. So when Jason came along, brimming with charm and what looked like sincere admiration, she didn't realize how starved she was for emotional connection until she found herself hanging on his every word. She believed he saw her in ways no one ever had. And that belief, more than anything, began to cloud her judgment. The first sign of trouble came 3 months after the honeymoon, when they were scheduled to attend Celeste's annual software development retreat in Colorado. It was something she'd never missed, a think tank-style event where researchers and developers like her gathered to brainstorm rehabilitation tools. Jason, who had once been eager to attend and even boasted about how proud he was of her recognition in the neurotech field, suddenly decided it was a waste of time. His exact words were, "No one outside that niche gives a damn about those boring medical codes." Celeste had blinked at him in shock. "You said you respected what I do," she said, searching his face for the warmth that once lived there. Jason only shrugged, already adjusting his tie and preparing for an online interview. "You're smart, Celeste, I'll give you that. But your field has a ceiling. My work, this thing I'm building, it's limitless. We can't afford distractions." The phrase "we can't afford distractions" would become a quiet dagger in their marriage, used whenever Celeste brought up something that didn't serve Jason's expanding ambition. He didn't accompany her to the retreat. Instead, she went alone, offered her panel presentation to a standing ovation, and returned home to find Jason too preoccupied to even ask how it went. That night, she cried quietly in the bathroom, unsure why she felt so alone in a marriage just months old. Over the next year, the changes grew less subtle and more bruising. Jason no longer asked about her projects or progress. He'd brush off her excitement with curt nods and barely looked up from his phone during their dinners. He became obsessed with building his online presence, hiring a brand consultant, investing in luxury suits, and tweaking his voice to sound more authoritative on financial podcasts. Celeste would support him at events, quietly in the background, wheeling her suitcase and adjusting his tie while he soaked up compliments. But when she needed him, when she published a breakthrough research paper or secured a grant, he was too busy to celebrate. Their home, once filled with conversations and mutual admiration, became a corridor of silence and ego. Mira, her best friend since high school, began asking subtle questions. "Does he make you feel supported? And are you still happy?" But Celeste, loyal to a fault and terrified of the shame of a failing marriage, always said, "It's just a phase. He's under pressure." She told herself this lie often, especially on the nights when she'd stay late in her home office, running simulations for her AI prototype while Jason posted shirtless photos with motivational captions like, "Hustle or die." And it was in one of those lonely nights, as she scrolled through her husband's social feed and saw him tagged at a rooftop party she hadn't even known about, that Celeste felt the first rumble of the coming storm, quiet, distant, but inevitable. Something was changing. Or perhaps, something had always been wrong, and she had just refused to see it. Jason Whitaker wasn't born into success. He clawed at it, tooth and nail, driven by a fire that burned hotter than most men could tolerate. His father, Leonard Whitaker, was a truck driver who walked out when Jason was 8, leaving his mother, Cheryl, to raise him and his older brother Dennis in a 2-bedroom house in the grittier side of Baltimore. Cheryl did what she could. She taught English at a local high school, pinching pennies while trying to raise 2 sons with polar opposite hearts. Dennis was the kind one, the helper, the boy who walked his mother to work and volunteered to care for their grandfather. Jason, on the other hand, was the ambitious one. He hated poverty. He hated the creaky fan in the kitchen, the expired cereal, the second-hand clothes. He made a vow on the night his father slammed the door and left for good, he would become so successful, no one would ever leave him again. That mindset turned him into a survivor, but it also hardened him. In college, Jason majored in finance not because he loved numbers, but because money, he believed, was the only armor against being abandoned. His mentors praised his charisma, and by the time he graduated, Jason had already built a small YouTube channel teaching financial hacks. It was amateur at first, but when one of his reels went viral, thanks to a quote stolen from a self-help book, he became addicted to the spotlight. The day he was featured in Forbes 10 Under 35 to Watch in Finance changed everything. It wasn't even a full article, just a half-paragraph mention, but it lit a wildfire in Jason's veins. He printed the page and framed it in his office. Overnight, he began branding himself as a celebrity wealth strategist. He hired a PR team, leased a luxury office space in Manhattan, and curated a persona, tailored suits, disciplined morning routines, empty coffee mugs and aesthetic photos, and perfectly timed motivational quotes. His clientele shifted from middle-class entrepreneurs to high-ticket personalities, influencers, and real estate moguls. He changed his vocabulary too. He started saying scaling instead of growth, exclusivity instead of quality. Celeste watched this transformation from the sidelines with growing unease. The man who used to hold her hand at midnight while talking about the future was now flying first class to Dubai for 2-day networking events and sharing photos of champagne brunches with captions like legacy over luxury, but both if you're strategic. He was becoming everything he once said he despised. Worse, he began needing to be seen, needed the world to validate him in ways Celeste never could. She was still coding programs to help stroke victims speak. He was making six-figure deals teaching millionaires how to hoard wealth. And the distance between them widened not just emotionally, but ideologically. Jason first met Naomi Cruz at a wealth-building podcast recording in Midtown Manhattan. She was a guest, bold, unapologetic, and as seductive as a question you weren't sure you should answer. A former nightclub hostess turned confidence coach, Naomi spoke about financial independence with an undertone of something darker, resentment, survival, vengeance wrapped in rhinestones. She wore red that day, blood red, something Jason never forgot. He was immediately captivated. Naomi didn't just appeal to him physically, she validated the new version of Jason he was becoming. She didn't ask him about his past or moral compass. She didn't care about the quiet, ethical man Celeste once loved. Naomi saw a man she could mold, or at least mirror. She was sharp, magnetic, and daring. She challenged his ego with flattery disguised as critique. "You could be bigger," she whispered after the show. "You're still playing nice." That sentence haunted Jason in the best and worst way. Over the next few months, he began meeting Naomi more frequently, under the guise of collaboration. Celeste heard Naomi's name in passing but thought little of it. After all, Jason often met clients, coaches, and influencers. But Naomi was different. She wasn't just working with Jason, she was intoxicating him. She flattered his worst instincts. And slowly, without any confrontation, Naomi Cruz started to replace Celeste, not in marriage, not yet, but in Jason's ambition, his heart, and his vision for what life should look like. It was the beginning of betrayal. But at that point, neither Celeste nor Jason realized just how far it would go. The rise had begun, but so had the rot beneath it. Naomi Cruz had never once been handed anything in life without fighting, manipulating, or clawing for it. Born in Miami to a single mother who vanished when she was 6, Naomi grew up in foster care, bouncing between homes that smelled of cigarette smoke, spilled beer, and broken promises. By the time she was 16, she had learned how to survive without needing to trust a soul. Her body matured faster than her heart ever could, and before long, she was dancing in underground clubs with fake IDs, hungry eyes watching her from all corners of the room. It wasn't glamorous, it was survival. Every smile she gave was calculated. Every man she entertained was a stepping stone. Naomi wasn't ashamed of the life she lived, she was angry about it. Furious, even. Furious that some girls got to grow up with fathers who held their hands and mothers who made them lunch. Furious that women like Celeste existed, smart, polished, and soft-hearted, and yet still found the love of a man like Jason. When she first saw his picture, she wasn't impressed by his looks, but by his trajectory. He had the smell of rising power, and Naomi knew power like a bloodhound knows scent. She had been following him online for months, planting comments under fake accounts, tagging mutual influencers, creating a web to pull him into. And it worked. The invitation to the Manhattan podcast was her golden ticket. Her red dress wasn't just fashion, it was strategy. After the podcast recording, Jason had asked Naomi to join him for drinks with the crew. She declined. Not out of coyness, but control. "Let me know when it's just us," she'd said, tilting her head, walking away without a backward glance. Jason watched her leave with a look Celeste hadn't seen on his face in over a year. The next day, Naomi sent him a voice note. "You're not like the other gurus, Jason. I see it. Let's build something real." It was bold. It was bait. And Jason bit. He began scheduling late-night Zoom meetings with her, rationalizing it as building synergy. He didn't tell Celeste about them, not because he believed he was cheating, but because Naomi made him feel unfiltered. With Celeste, things had grown too serious. Her wheelchair, her health concerns, her quiet, intense passion for healing others, it all felt too heavy, too human. Naomi, on the other hand, was a fantasy built in high heels and ambition. She listened, laughed, mirrored his goals, and most importantly, she admired him for what he was becoming, not what he once was. As their meetings grew frequent, Naomi slipped her way into more spaces, offering suggestions about his online brand, rewriting captions, planting doubts about the emotional weight of his marriage. "Sometimes, Jason," she whispered during one late call, "you outgrow people who can't run beside you." Meanwhile, Celeste felt the distance between her and Jason growing, but couldn't place its shape. He was still present in body, attending dinners, occasionally showing up to her therapy sessions, but absent in spirit. His phone was always face down. His smile, when it came, felt rehearsed. And Naomi? Just a name mentioned casually, always attached to business. Celeste wanted to believe she was being paranoid. She had suffered enough embarrassment in her life to recognize how humiliating it would be to accuse her husband of infidelity without proof. So she buried it, focused on her recovery, her AI project, and leaned on Mira for quiet strength. But the silence was killing her. She began noticing subtle changes, Jason's cologne lingering late at night, receipts tucked in his briefcase for restaurants they'd never visited together, and his new obsession with appearance. When she brought up her concern about Naomi, Jason scoffed. "You're insecure because she's younger, that's all," he said. It stung. Celeste, who had once believed they were building a future together, now felt like furniture in his home, useful, motionless, and replaceable. One night, after dinner, Jason left for an overnight client summit. He didn't know that Mira had seen Naomi post a selfie in the same suite Jason claimed was for finance executives only. The truth wasn't just near. It was already wrapping its claws around everything Celeste thought was solid. But she wasn't ready to confront it. Not yet. Sometimes, betrayal needs time to grow into a wound deep enough to scar. The day Celeste's world collapsed didn't come with warning bells. It came quietly, like most devastating things do, wrapped in a smile she forced onto her lips and a body that had grown weary of pretending everything was okay. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Jason had just left the house claiming he was heading to a business brunch. Celeste, exhausted after her fourth night of little to no sleep, had spent the morning reviewing data for a neural response tracking project. Her headaches had returned, sharper and more intrusive, but she had grown used to pushing through pain. She believed that if she just kept working, kept producing, the numbness creeping into her fingertips and the trembling in her left leg would eventually stop. Mira had urged her to see a neurologist weeks ago, but Celeste, too busy trying to keep up appearances for Jason, brushed it off. "It's just stress," she told herself, even as she struggled to grasp her pen that morning. But that afternoon, while walking across the living room to answer a video call from a research lab in Montreal, her legs gave out from under her like matchsticks snapping. She didn't scream, there wasn't even time. Her vision blurred, her hearing rang, and the world spun as she hit the ground. The phone lay blinking beside her. The last thing she remembered was Jason's face on the photo frame on the wall, frozen in time, smiling in a way that now felt like a lie. When Celeste woke up, she was in a sterile hospital room, the low hum of machines beating in rhythm with her confused thoughts. Mira sat beside her, holding her hand, pale and sleepless. "You had a stroke," she said softly, as if saying it gently would reduce the horror. Celeste blinked at her, the weight of the words sinking like cement into her chest. Her left side was numb, her speech slurred, and her body foreign. Mira explained how she had come over after Celeste didn't respond to her texts. She found her collapsed and barely conscious, and rushed her to the ER. Jason hadn't arrived yet. In fact, he hadn't even picked up Myra's calls until she left him 5 voicemails. He finally showed up that evening, dressed in a pressed navy blazer and Gucci loafers, looking more irritated than concerned. "You didn't tell me she was this bad," he muttered to Mira, as if Celeste was a liability, not a person. Myra's eyes burned holes into him, but Celeste, too weak to speak, just stared at him, her heart breaking more from his absence than the paralysis. He touched her hand briefly, kissed her forehead like a stranger, then stepped out to take a call, Naomi's name flashing across his screen. From that moment, Celeste knew something in their marriage had died long before her body betrayed her. What made it worse, what made it unbearable, was what followed the next morning. Naomi showed up at the hospital. She waltzed in wearing oversized sunglasses, carrying a gift bag, and smiling as if she had walked into a birthday party, not an ICU wing. "I'm Jason's assistant," she told the nurses. "He asked me to check on Mrs. Whitaker." Mira nearly lunged at her, but Celeste, weak and stunned, simply stared. Naomi's voice dripped with faux sweetness as she placed a lip balm and a card beside the bed. "He sends his love," she whispered. Then she leaned in close to Celeste's ear and added, "You should rest. You've had enough attention lately, haven't you?" It was the moment Naomi crossed the invisible line. Celeste tried to respond, but her tongue felt heavy, and her body wouldn't cooperate. Naomi left the room before Mira could drag her out. Jason didn't come back that night. He didn't even call. Dr. Rania Koenig, a calm and sharp neurologist with decades of experience, was the one who told Celeste she had experienced a partial ischemic stroke, likely triggered by long-term stress, poor sleep, and elevated blood pressure. "You'll recover," she said, placing her hand gently over Celeste's. "But only if you stop pretending you're not breaking." That night, alone and half paralyzed, Celeste finally cried. Not because she had a stroke, but because she knew she'd given her heart to a man who didn't even have the decency to break it properly. Mira Larkin had always known how to read people. It wasn't a talent, it was a skill refined by pain and sharpened through survival. She didn't trust easily, and she had every reason not to. 10 years earlier, a breast cancer diagnosis derailed her medical internship, and while the disease nearly took her life, it also stripped the illusions from it. The man she thought would stand by her ghosted her the moment her hair began to fall. Her father refused to help with the treatment costs, claiming she'd made her bed choosing medicine over marriage. It was her mother, soft-spoken but iron-willed, who nursed her back to health, and when she passed 2 years later, Mira vowed never to waste time on people who didn't mean what they said. That's why Jason always rubbed her the wrong way. She saw through his tailored smiles and influencer speak from the beginning. He was one of those men who only loved power, not people. And now, seeing Celeste in a hospital bed, vulnerable and betrayed, confirmed every instinct Mira had silenced to keep the peace. Naomi's sudden appearance at the hospital was the final trigger. "Assistant, my ass," Mira muttered as she sat in her car that night, scrolling through Naomi's social media profiles. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, only that she needed to find something that proved what Celeste couldn't yet face, that her marriage was being gutted from the inside, and Jason was letting it happen. It didn't take long before inconsistencies surfaced. Naomi's page was a glossy highlight reel of curated luxury, designer brands, posh brunches, yacht parties, and cryptic captions like "You can't steal what's already mine." Mira dug deeper. The business Naomi claimed to run, Cruise Confidence Coaching, had no registered LLC, no client testimonials, and no real address. Her website was a one-page template, full of stock photos and generic affirmations. But what really set off alarm bells was a blurry video posted on a now-deleted Instagram story from one of Naomi's friends. It was taken inside a Manhattan suite, Jason's suite, judging by the view, and in the corner, clear as daylight, was Jason himself, shirtless and drinking wine, laughing while Naomi's voice giggled from behind the camera. Mira downloaded the video before it vanished. She stared at it for hours, trying to decide whether to send it to Celeste. But Celeste was in no state to handle this truth, not yet. She was still recovering from a stroke. Her speech was returning slowly, and her left side had regained a little movement, but emotionally, she was hanging by a thread. Mira decided to hold onto the evidence, keep digging. Because this wasn't just about Jason cheating. This was about Naomi deliberately trying to replace Celeste, and Jason aiding her, silently, selfishly, spinelessly. Mira made a promise to herself that night: she wouldn't let Naomi win. Not with lies. Not with manipulation. And especially not while Celeste was too broken to fight. 2 days later, Mira paid Jason an unannounced visit. She found him at his office, filming content for his latest financial leadership summit. He wasn't expecting her, and the moment he saw her, his easy grin faltered. "If you're here to play detective, save it," he said, waving away his assistant and gesturing for Mira to sit. But she didn't. She stood firm, arms crossed, holding her phone with the video cued and ready. "She had a stroke, Jason. And you're drinking wine in a hotel with a woman who calls herself your assistant," she said, voice low and lethal. Jason's jaw clenched, but he recovered quickly, scoffing as he leaned back in his seat. "You don't understand what I'm building. Celeste's condition, it slows things down. Naomi gets it. She supports the vision." Mira stared at him in disbelief. "Your wife nearly died, and all you can talk about is vision?" Jason didn't flinch. "This is bigger than emotions, Mira. You wouldn't understand." Her fingers itched to slap him. Instead, she left the office, teeth grinding, disgust churning in her chest. Jason had crossed the line. This wasn't just neglect. It was strategic abandonment. That night, Mira sat beside Celeste, watching her sleep. When she finally stirred and whispered Jason's name in confusion, Mira simply held her hand and lied gently, "He's just been busy." Because right now, Celeste needed hope. But Mira was preparing for war. Naomi Cruz thrived on chaos, not the loud, reckless kind that shattered rooms, but the precise, whisper-soft chaos that crept in silently, dismantled everything, and left her standing in the center untouched. By the time she fully embedded herself in Jason's life, she had mapped out every weak point, his obsession with image, his need for validation, his secret resentment toward Celeste's illness, and the fragility of his carefully curated brand. She didn't need to sleep with Jason to control him, at least not yet. All she had to do was manipulate the narrative of who was holding him back. She encouraged him to be bolder in his speaking engagements, urged him to drop the deadweight partnerships, and rebranded his social media with sleek visuals, mood lighting, and captions like "Power doesn't apologize." Every compliment she gave was weaponized. Every time he confided in her about Celeste's health struggles, Naomi would tilt her head with practiced pity and whisper something like, "That must be exhausting for someone with your potential." Jason ate it up. Slowly, Naomi began suggesting changes: move to a new penthouse to reflect your status, hire new assistants who were brand conscious, and subtly pull away from Celeste, who was too private to align with your growth. Jason didn't even realize he was handing her his life piece by piece, wrapped in the illusion that he was in control. Within 2 months, Jason had relocated into a high-rise penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, citing temporary peace for work focus. Naomi decorated the space, all modern chrome, dark marble, and sensual lighting, nothing like the warm, book-filled apartment Celeste had designed back in Boston. Naomi made sure there was no trace of the old life. She burned sage in the rooms and jokingly called it a detox of the past. She started appearing in Jason's behind-the-scenes videos, managing his calendar, and directing his brand shoots. To the public, she was just an assistant. Behind closed doors, she was the architect of his downfall disguised as a partner in ambition. Naomi also began mocking Celeste's attempts to reach Jason, rolling her eyes when Celeste's name appeared on his caller ID, sending one-word replies like "not now" or "busy." Once, while Jason was on a live Zoom, Naomi read out one of Celeste's texts aloud in a mocking tone, "I'm feeling stronger today. The therapist said there's hope for full recovery." Then she turned to Jason and laughed, "Recovery from what? A broken marriage?" Jason chuckled without guilt, too far gone to realize how cruel he'd become. And while Naomi escalated, she remained careful, never leaving visible footprints. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that someone close to her had begun to notice. Someone with eyes that saw through the glamour. Nina Foster had shared a 2-bedroom condo with Naomi for over a year, and though she once considered her a friend, she now watched her with growing disgust. Nina had known Naomi during her broke days, when she was scraping money for rent, living off microwave noodles, and still dreaming of being seen. But the woman Naomi had become was a stranger, calculated, venomous, dangerous. Nina wasn't blind. She saw the messages Naomi deleted, the burner phone she used to manipulate Jason's calendar, the way she coached herself in the mirror before meetings with fake smiles and power poses. Naomi had even started keeping a private folder labeled backup plans on her locked laptop. Nina had seen it briefly when Naomi left her screen open. But what Nina noticed most was the cruelty, the way Naomi gloated when Celeste's health updates came in, or how she played Jason and Celeste against each other with surgical precision. Nina, naturally observant and quiet, began recording short voice memos of Naomi's rants and keeping screenshots of her chats on her secondary device. She didn't know why at first, only that it felt wrong to let someone so vile win unchecked. Naomi once bragged during a wine-fueled evening, "She's half paralyzed and still trying to hold on." Some women just don't know when to let go. That night, Nina started her own private archive, unlabeled and locked. She didn't know if or when she'd use it, but her instincts told her this story was going to explode. And when it did, she intended to have front-row receipts. The rehabilitation center smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and lavender air freshener, an odd attempt to make pain feel like home. The sun filtered weakly through the blinds of Celeste's room, casting long diagonal lines across her motionless legs. Her left hand remained stubborn, unreliable, even as her right one gripped the pen shakily over her lap journal. Dr. Rania Koenig, her neurologist, had encouraged journaling as a form of cognitive therapy, an outlet for the emotional paralysis that often mirrored the physical. But Celeste didn't write about hope or healing. She wrote letters. Long, winding, uncensored letters addressed to Jason, but never sent. In them, she poured the grief she wasn't allowed to express out loud. She wrote about how she used to count the freckles on his shoulder while he slept, how she memorized the way he stirred his coffee clockwise, and how every version of their love had died before she could bury it. "Dear Jason," one entry began, "do you even remember the promises you made while my hands were still steady? Or did your love vanish the moment my legs stopped working?" Some days, the pages were soaked in silent tears, on others, the ink carved out quiet rage. She never signed them. These weren't letters for delivery, they were tombstones for emotions that would never be acknowledged. But the most haunting letters weren't to Jason, they were to herself. In the quietest hours of the night, when Mira had gone home and the nurses made their final rounds, Celeste would sit with the journal open, whispering her truths into paper. "Dear me," she wrote one night, "you are not weak because someone walked away. You are not broken because your body needed time. You are not unlovable because he made you feel invisible." These were the words she never dared say aloud, even to Mira. Because despite the strength everyone projected onto her, Celeste still woke with nightmares where Jason stood at the foot of her bed, arms folded, telling her she wasn't enough. She dreamt of Naomi's laughter echoing down sterile hallways. During her physical therapy, when her leg trembled with effort, Celeste didn't picture herself walking into Jason's arms, she pictured walking away. Each journal entry became an act of defiance, a whisper against the storm, a promise to herself that even if she was discarded like a malfunctioning machine, she would rebuild from the parts that still worked. And though she hadn't yet told a soul, a new desire stirred beneath her grief, not just to survive this, but to rise beyond it. Not for revenge. Not even for justice. But for herself. It was Brandon Sharp who unknowingly became the first to notice this silent awakening. A former colleague from Celeste's research lab and once a close friend, Brandon had reached out after hearing about her stroke through the Institute's wellness bulletin. He arrived with flowers, not the typical bright, pitiful ones people bring to the sick, but soft eucalyptus branches wrapped in navy paper, simple and dignified. "I thought you'd prefer calm over cheer," he said. Brandon had always been intuitive, the type of man who noticed when someone skipped lunch 3 days in a row or when their smiles didn't reach their eyes. Years ago, he had admired Celeste's drive from a distance, working late on her prototypes while Jason would call to rush her home. Now, standing at the foot of her hospital bed, he saw a woman who looked hollowed, but not defeated. During their short visit, he mentioned a new neurosoftware lab in Portland that was testing an advanced motor response mapping AI. "They need a consultant," he said softly, "and your name came up." Celeste looked at him, startled. "You think I can still contribute?" Brandon nodded without hesitation. "I know you can. But more importantly, you need to remember that." After he left, Celeste returned to her journal, hands trembling with something unfamiliar, possibility. And for the first time in weeks, she wrote a letter not to Jason, nor herself, but to the future. It read, "Dear tomorrow, I'm coming for you. You'll know me by the scars I wear like medals." Jason stood in front of his full-length bathroom mirror, adjusting the cuffs of his Italian suit while reciting the final lines of his keynote speech. His face looked flawless under the glow of ring lights, his voice was crisp, polished. But no amount of designer clothing or curated charm could conceal the truth beginning to fester beneath the surface. Over the past month, several of Jason's clients, small business owners and self-funded dreamers, had begun complaining in hushed corners of the internet that his coaching blueprint was recycled fluff. A few claimed they never received their promised one-on-one consultations. One even alleged financial manipulation through high-return group investments that mysteriously went quiet after Naomi took over logistics. But Jason, consumed by ego and obsessed with scale, dismissed the murmurs as the grumblings of the ungrateful. "They don't know how this game works," he told Naomi after a tense boardroom call. Naomi agreed, of course, she always did, with the kind of loyalty born not from love, but from shared ambition. Yet behind closed doors, even Naomi was beginning to feel the weight of Jason's unraveling empire. They poured so much into creating the illusion of success, but illusions, like glass, always shattered when stretched too thin. Their recent luxury client campaign flopped after Naomi mistakenly leaked content that wasn't legally cleared. Jason screamed at her, his voice echoing down the penthouse hall. For the first time, Naomi didn't shrink. She stared back, cold and unmoved, then left without a word. The mirror Jason once trusted to reflect greatness now mocked him with fractures, ones he could no longer ignore. Back in Boston, Celeste found herself growing sharper, more grounded with each passing therapy session. Her body was still rebuilding, but her mind had already begun rewriting the story. She wasn't the frail woman who waited for love to return. She was a woman now assembling her identity from pain, betrayal, and rediscovered purpose. Brandon's frequent visits had become both a bomb and a spark. He never overstepped, never pitted her, but he challenged her thinking in ways Jason never had. During one visit, he brought her a USB drive containing early drafts of her old neurosimulation models from their joint research days. "You once said these algorithms could change everything," he reminded her, placing the device in her palm. That night, Celeste stayed up late reviewing the code, her mind alive in ways it hadn't been in months. She began drafting a revision model, correcting errors, inputting fresh data with the help of an adaptive keyboard. But even in the rhythm of creation, doubt lingered. Her mind often drifted to Jason, not out of longing, but calculation. Something didn't add up. His silence, Naomi's intrusion, the shifting tone in Jason's public videos, he was hiding more than just infidelity. She began rewatching old live streams and comparing timestamps to events he'd lied about. Slowly, a mosaic of inconsistency began to form, like a map pointing to a larger betrayal. Celeste didn't yet know what Jason was covering up, but she was no longer afraid to find out. Meanwhile, Naomi was spiraling in her own quiet way. Her curated life, once filled with invitation-only events and #PowerCouple content, had started to develop cracks too. Influencer friends whispered behind her back about her sudden wealth and lack of transparency. Brand partnerships were pulling out. One even sued for breach of contract over false engagement metrics Naomi had fabricated. And at home, Jason had become volatile, angry at failing numbers, irritable with Naomi's every suggestion. She found herself rewatching the videos of herself laughing in Jason's penthouse, trying to recapture the feeling of control she once had. It was slipping. Worse, Naomi didn't know that Nina, her own roommate, had been archiving her downfall like a digital diary of karma in motion. Nina had screen-recorded their phone logs, stored screenshots of Naomi's emails to Jason instructing him to delay Celeste's medical funding, and even downloaded location data proving Naomi had been in Aspen with Jason when he lied about being in San Diego for a summit. Nina wasn't sure when she'd strike, but she knew the truth was rotting from within, and timing would make all the difference. The mirror Naomi used to worship herself in now showed something else entirely, a woman who had climbed the mountain only to realize the foundation beneath her heels was beginning to crack, and when it crumbled, it wouldn't be a soft fall. It would be spectacular. The invitation had arrived on cream gold cardstock, embossed with Jason's signature logo, a golden lionhead crest that had come to symbolize wealth, ambition, and dominance. The words were clear and concise: Evening of Legacy, a private celebration of influence and resilience. Celeste had stared at the invite for minutes, unsure if it was a mistake. It had been months since she'd seen Jason in person. And yet, there it was, her name printed cleanly, no +1, and a handwritten note on the back: "You should be seeing J." Mira was instantly suspicious. "It's a setup," she warned. "Why now?" Why in public? But Celeste, now walking unassisted for short distances and regaining clarity, made her own decision. I need to be seen, Mira. Not for him. For me. Dressed in an emerald gown that accented the strength she was reclaiming, Celeste entered the upscale Beacon Hill venue quietly but with unmistakable grace. The room was a hive of camera flashes, murmuring influencers, and moneyed power players. Jason stood at the head of it all, laughing in a tailored black tux, his arm around a vacant space where Naomi would soon arrive. For the first time in months, Celeste felt the ache of being out of place, but she held her chin high. This wasn't her world anymore, but it didn't mean she had to disappear from it. Jason was visibly startled when he saw her, his smile stuttered just a fraction, but he quickly masked it with charm and made his way toward her. Celeste, he said with full warmth, you look recovered. The phrasing wasn't accidental. His voice was loud enough to catch a few ears nearby, and Celeste caught the subtle tilt of his phone camera, positioned ever so slightly to capture the interaction. She nodded calmly. Stronger than ever, she replied. She was prepared for awkwardness, even manipulation, but what she wasn't prepared for was Naomi's theatrical entrance just 20 minutes later. Draped in crimson silk, with her hair pinned like a Hollywood siren and diamonds glittering at her ears, Naomi entered the room like it belonged to her. Jason met her halfway, and they exchanged a kiss far too intimate for business partners. Gasps fluttered through the guests as heads turned. Celeste stood frozen, suddenly the centerpiece of a well-planned humiliation. Naomi caught her eye across the room, then smiled like a cat at a cornered mouse. Darling, she purred loudly enough for others to hear, you're so brave for showing up. Most women in your condition wouldn't. A few scattered laughs cracked through the room like thunder on glass. Mira, watching from the shadows, gripped her clutch tighter, ready to unleash hell. But Celeste didn't break. Not then. She took a slow, measured breath and turned back toward the bar, letting Naomi bask in the attention she was so desperate for. The cameras began flashing, snippets of Celeste in her gown, Naomi by Jason's side, the tension crackling like static in the air. The real war wasn't in words but optics. Celeste knew it. Jason knew it. And Naomi had just drawn blood in public. Later that evening, while guests mingled and reporters whispered, Naomi took it one step further. She approached Celeste holding a glass of red wine and, with the same syrupy tone, said, he was always too much for you, you know. Some men require stamina. She faked a stumble, splashing wine across Celeste's dress in an accidental spill. Before anyone could intervene, Naomi leaned in with a smirk and whispered, you should have stayed in the rehab center where you belonged. Mira reached them a second too late, pulling Celeste aside as the cameras clicked once more. But it was done. Celeste had been publicly humiliated. What Naomi didn't know was that Nina, ever the quiet witness, had followed her to the event and caught the entire scene on video. And later that night, while Naomi celebrated her victory, Nina sent an encrypted copy of the footage to Brandon and Mira. The dinner was over, but the real war, the one Naomi thought she was winning, had only just begun. Celeste hadn't spoken much on the drive back from the event. The silence in the car wasn't uncomfortable, but it was weighty, full of unshed words and clenched fists. Mira drove with one hand on the wheel and the other occasionally reaching over to touch Celeste's shoulder. You held your ground, Mira said gently. You didn't flinch. That takes strength. Celeste stared out the window, still in the ruined emerald dress, stained by Naomi's cruelty. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction, she murmured. But inside, her heart was in splinters. She had known Jason was distant, had suspected Naomi was more than an assistant, but seeing it displayed like theater, with champagne, diamonds, and red silk, was an entirely different wound. It was a betrayal not just of marriage, but of dignity. Her mind replayed the moment Naomi poured that wine with such precision, the taunt that followed, and Jason's subtle, complicit smirk. That smirk was the dagger. It confirmed what she had been afraid to accept. Jason wasn't lost in someone else's game. He was helping script it. And worse, he didn't care if Celeste was destroyed in the process. That night, as Mira tucked her into the guest room of her home, Celeste didn't cry. She stared at the ceiling and finally whispered to herself, he's not coming back. He never was. Meanwhile, Jason's ego was inflamed, not with guilt, but with delusion. The dinner had made headlines, photos of him and Naomi, Celeste's appearance, the tension, it all made for great speculation and better publicity. His media team spun it as a brave reunion with his ailing wife during a celebration of resilience. Jason even posted a photo of himself between the two women with a caption that read, "Sometimes the past and the present meet in the same room, what matters is how you rise through it." Naomi, of course, approved the wording, but she didn't like that Celeste had stolen attention. "You need to cut her off," she told Jason, curled against him in the penthouse later that night. "She's a shadow dragging you down." Jason hesitated for only a second. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Celeste's voice still echoed from their early years, her belief in him, her quiet pride when he succeeded without selling his soul. But Naomi's lips were on his neck now, her words laced with venomous seduction. "Let me make it easier," she said, pulling out a thick envelope she'd prepared. Inside were divorce papers, with Jason's signature forged on all but one line. "All you have to do is finalize it," she whispered, her eyes gleaming. Jason stared at it for a long moment, and then, with numb fingers, picked up a pen. The next morning, Celeste received a package delivered by courier, no return address. Inside were the signed divorce papers, neatly clipped with a typed note, "It's time to move on. J." Her hands trembled as she read it, but she didn't cry. Mira, standing behind her, could see the shift in her eyes. It wasn't just heartbreak anymore. It was the moment steel replaced silk. Celeste sat at the kitchen table, still and silent, then reached for her journal, tore out the most recent entry she'd written to Jason, and lit a match. "No more letters," she said softly. "Only action now." At that same moment, Dennis Whitaker, Jason's estranged older brother, called Celeste after reading about the event in a business tabloid. "I saw the news," he said. "It made me sick. I want to help." She hadn't spoken to Dennis in years, but his voice was calm and unwavering. "I always liked you more than him," he added. "He's changed. And he needs to learn what happens when you break something that good." The call ended, but the energy remained. Celeste no longer needed Jason's love or Naomi's approval. She had allies. She had evidence. And most importantly, she had herself, wounded, yes, but rising. Jason had chosen his path. Now, it was her turn to choose hers. And it would not involve forgiveness. The rain had begun that morning without warning, a gray drizzle that clung to the windows of the Boston townhouse like grief refusing to let go. Celeste sat alone in the mansion's sitting room, wrapped in a cashmere shawl, staring at the fire Jason had once built for her during winter months she now realized were performative at best. The house, once warm and filled with soft jazz and the scent of chamomile tea, now felt hollow, like a memory that had overstayed its welcome. She had come back not to plead or linger in delusion, but to collect a few remaining personal items, her journals, a family heirloom from her late grandmother, and a framed wedding photo that once made her believe love could be permanent. Mira had offered to accompany her, but Celeste declined. She wanted to face the silence alone, one last time. Her wheelchair moved smoothly across the marble floor, guided by muscles she was regaining control over, but still required caution. She paused at the edge of the room, fingers grazing the piano she hadn't played since before the stroke, before Naomi, before betrayal. The house echoed with absence, until the front door slammed open with a gust of cold air and clicking heels that announced the arrival of a storm more violent than thunder. Naomi entered like she owned the place, draped in a skin-tight white dress, sunglasses perched atop her head despite the weather, and a designer tote swinging from her arm. She stopped dead when she saw Celeste. For a moment, she looked surprised, as if she hadn't expected to find her there. But then her lips curled into a smirk that chilled the room more than the wind. "Oh," she sneered, sauntering closer, "they let you out of your pity palace?" Celeste didn't respond. Her silence only seemed to enrage Naomi more. She stepped forward, circled her like a vulture, her voice rising with every word. "Still trying to cling to scraps, huh? Still thinking he's coming back?" Her voice dropped to a venomous whisper as she leaned close. "Quit fooling yourself, bitch. He doesn't want you anymore." Celeste's breath caught in her throat, not just from the words, but from the hate behind them. Then, without warning, Naomi placed both hands on the wheelchair handles, yanked it back, and shoved Celeste forward. The chair jolted, tilted sideways, and Celeste's body hit the polished floor with a loud, sickening thud. The pain that radiated through her shoulder was nothing compared to the crack in her soul as Naomi laughed, an unholy sound echoing through the mansion. "Oops," she said with a shrug. "Guess you need more therapy." At that exact moment, Jason walked in from the hallway, holding a manila folder, his phone pressed to his ear. He froze, eyes darting from Naomi to Celeste on the ground. The air snapped with tension. For a fleeting second, Celeste thought, prayed, he might rush to help her. But instead, he lowered the phone slowly, stepped forward, and looked down at her with disgust. "What are you doing here?" he asked, voice devoid of emotion. "Didn't I tell you to stop making scenes?" Celeste tried to speak, to push herself up, but Jason moved past her without offering a hand, tossing the folder onto the coffee table. "You should just get lost already," he added coldly. Naomi stifled another laugh, walking up behind him and wrapping her arms around his waist like a victor posing with her prize. Celeste, still on the floor, stared at the two of them, her husband and the woman who had become her executioner, and felt something inside her shatter. But it wasn't despair this time. It wasn't grief. It was resolve. Something deeper. Something ancient. The kind of fire that is born not from survival, but from the decision to rise. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply reached for the armrest, slowly pulled herself toward the chair, and looked up through tears that didn't fall. Jason turned away. Naomi whispered, "Pathetic." But as Celeste gripped the wheel and steadied herself, a voice inside her whispered louder, "This is the last time." And it was. The hospital hallway buzzed with fluorescent light and the low murmur of rolling carts, but to Mira, everything felt like a scream. Her heels clacked with urgency as she rushed alongside Celeste's gurney, gripping her friend's trembling hand while trying to contain the fury rising in her chest. The emergency call had come from a neighbor who found Celeste collapsed on the marble floor, blood dried along her wrist from a gash where she hit the corner of the coffee table. Mira had been at a conference when she received the call. She didn't even grab her coat, just her keys, her ID, and the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. She said nothing happened, the neighbor told her. But her eyes. They were dead. As Mira sat beside Celeste in the ER room, she looked at the bruises beginning to bloom on her friend's shoulder, the stiffness in her limbs that had nothing to do with a stroke, and she knew, without a doubt, Jason had crossed a line he could never walk back from. Celeste was silent at first, trying to steady her breathing as Dr. Koenig examined her again. But when the door finally closed behind the nurse and Mira leaned in, whispering, "Who did this to you?" Celeste broke. Not with tears, but with words. "Naomi pushed me," she said hoarsely. Jason stood there. He didn't help. He told me to get lost. Myra's jaw clenched. "That's enough," she said through gritted teeth. "We're not protecting him anymore." That night, Mira contacted Dennis Whitaker. She had always respected Jason's older brother, quiet, grounded, nothing like his narcissistic sibling. Dennis listened calmly as Mira laid out everything, the affair, the hospital incident, Naomi's intrusion, and now physical assault. "He thinks she's alone," Mira said. "But she's not. And he's going to learn what it feels like to be on the other side of power." Dennis agreed to fly to Boston within 24 hours, already calling in favors from his legal contacts in Chicago. Meanwhile, Brandon had also stepped up, coordinating with Mira to secure home surveillance footage from the security firm responsible for Jason's house. But the most unexpected, and powerful, support came from Nina Foster. The quiet roommate who had remained in the shadows finally stepped into the light. She had seen enough. After watching Naomi shove Celeste and hearing her brag about it later, Nina had gathered every recording, every screenshot, every vile voice note into a carefully encrypted folder labeled Fire. That evening, she emailed it, anonymously, to Myra's work inbox with the subject line, "Proof. Use it well." What Mira found inside made her skin crawl. Voice memos of Naomi mocking Celeste's condition. Footage of Jason laughing as Naomi discussed withholding Celeste's medical funds. And the final clip, Naomi gloating in front of a mirror, "She'll never walk again. But even if she does, she'll never walk into his life again." That file, more than anything, ignited a fire in Mira that she hadn't felt since beating cancer. They weren't just going to expose them. They were going to bury them. The following morning, Celeste sat propped up in bed, her arm bandaged, her shoulder in a soft brace, as Judge Ellen Park's name appeared on the consultation list outside her room. Mira had pulled every string she could to fast-track an emergency restraining order and initiate an abuse report. Judge Parks, stern, sharp, and known for her zero-tolerance stance on domestic exploitation, walked in without ceremony, her gray suit crisp and eyes direct. "Ms. Whitaker," she said, sitting at Celeste's bedside, "I've seen women in worse conditions stay silent. But I also know silence breeds predators. Are you ready to speak?" Celeste hesitated only for a heartbeat. Then she nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I am." She recounted everything, every insult, every dismissal, every humiliation. Mira stood by her the whole time, unwavering. By the end, Judge Parks removed her glasses, folded her hands, and said, "We'll begin the process immediately. You have more power than you realize, Celeste. Don't hand it back." As she left, Celeste turned to Mira. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to fight him," she whispered. Mira smiled softly, brushing a stray curl from her friend's face. "You don't have to fight him alone. And you're not just strong enough, Celeste, you're finally awake." In that sterile hospital room filled with echoes of trauma, a seed of resolve took root in Celeste's chest, deeper than fear, deeper than pain. This wasn't just recovery anymore. It was war. And this time, she had an army. Jason Whitaker had always believed he was untouchable. That belief had built the skyscraper of his arrogance, floor by floor, brick by brick. In his world, image outweighed truth, perception trumped integrity, and as long as the cameras loved him, no one else needed to. But what he didn't realize, what all men intoxicated by their own mythology failed to see, was that illusions fracture the moment truth becomes louder than denial. It began with a whisper, a minor podcast host calling out Jason's outdated wealth principles and shady affiliate links. Then came a disgruntled former client filing a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission about being scammed out of a $20,000 personalized coaching package that never existed. Still, Jason brushed it off, blaming haters, telling Naomi, "These nobodies always crawl out when you're winning." But within a week, his inbox was flooded with refund demands, angry DMs, and a cease and desist letter from a fintech company accusing him of stealing proprietary branding materials for his latest online course. His inner circle shrank overnight. His PR firm dropped him without explanation. Sponsors ghosted. Banks froze his accounts pending fraud investigations. The glossy shell cracked, then shattered. The final blow came when a viral Twitter thread exposed screenshots, contracts, and manipulated testimonials, all traced back to Jason and Naomi's influence marketing scheme. The thread trended for days under the hashtag Whitaker fraud. The lionhead crest, once his crown jewel, had become a symbol of scandal. He was no longer a mogul. He was a meme. Naomi panicked first. She locked herself in the penthouse bathroom for hours, deleting accounts, wiping devices, calling her attorney in tears. "I didn't know this would go this far," she hissed at Jason, voice trembling with rage and fear. But Jason, drunk on entitlement and the bitterness of exposure, snapped. "You were in this as much as I was," he shouted, smashing a glass against the wall. "Don't you dare run now." But Naomi was already packing, already plotting an exit route that didn't include taking the fall. She reached out to a contact at a luxury agency in Dubai, hoping to escape before indictments were filed. But Nina Foster had already anticipated that move. With Mira and Brandon's help, she submitted every shred of evidence to federal authorities, including timestamps, audio files, and Naomi's digital confession recorded accidentally during a drunk voice note rant. By the time Jason received the official notice of investigation and Naomi's arrest warrant was issued, the media frenzy was unstoppable. Journalists circled his home. Investors pulled out. Speaking events were canceled. The man who once taught others how to build wealth had now become a cautionary tale of what happened when greed outpaced ethics. Celeste watched it unfold on the news, silent, composed, and still healing, but the small smile that played on her lips was not one of revenge. It was recognition. Recognition that justice, when delayed, is not denied, only gathering weight. Back in the hospital rehabilitation wing, Celeste had begun to walk short distances without assistance. Each step came with a grimace, but none with regret. She watched Jason's televised apology from the common room. He looked pale, defeated, reading from a script that lacked conviction. Mistakes were made, he droned. I never intended harm. But even as his voice cracked, the crowd didn't buy it. The comments flooded in, scammer in a suit. Where's your conscience, Jason? Karma wore red this time. Celeste turned off the screen and returned to her therapy session. Dr. Koenig, who had been following the news as well, nodded at her. You're doing more than healing, she said softly. You're becoming whole. Celeste didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her strength wasn't loud, it was consistent. It was born from every tear swallowed, every bruise ignored, every whisper turned inward that now rose as battle cries of resilience. Jason had lost more than his empire. He had lost the one person who once would have fought beside him in a storm. And Naomi? She was spotted attempting to board a private jet in LAX with a fake passport and 2 duffel bags of cash. She never made it through TSA. Celeste stood in front of the mirror later that evening, stared at her reflection, the eyes no longer hollow, the shoulders squarer, and whispered, You tried to bury me. But I'm still here. The morning air smelled different now. It was no longer thick with dread or the stale, sterile scent of hospital corridors. It smelled like grass, sky, and freedom. Celeste stood at the edge of the community trail just behind Myra's neighborhood, her legs trembling not from fear, but anticipation. It had been months of slow, grinding recovery, of learning how to speak clearly again, how to grip a spoon without shaking, how to pull herself up after falling. Dr. Koenig had said full recovery might take years, but Celeste wasn't interested in timelines anymore. She was interested in milestones. And this morning, with a pair of customized running shoes laced tight on her feet, her body upright without support, and her breath steady, she was about to cross one she never believed possible, her first jog since the stroke. Brandon stood a few feet behind her, not as a coach or a motivator, but as a friend with presence. He didn't speak. He just gave her a nod, silent encouragement from someone who understood that this wasn't about finishing a race. It was about starting again. She took her first step, then another. Her pace was awkward at first, a stagger between memory and movement, but then something miraculous happened. Her body remembered. And when her right foot struck the earth a little harder, a little faster, she ran. She didn't run far, just a quarter mile, but when she stopped, breathless and sweating, tears blurred her vision. Brandon reached her seconds later with a bottle of water and a towel, but she didn't take them right away. She looked up at the morning sun breaking through the clouds and laughed. It was a sound she hadn't heard from herself in almost a year. I did it, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. You did, Brandon replied softly, eyes full of pride. And you'll do more. That day marked a transformation. Celeste returned to Myra's house and immediately began sketching plans to revisit her AI prototype. Brandon offered to set up a dedicated workspace for her in one of his firm's satellite labs in Cambridge. No one deserves a second beginning more than you, he told her. They worked together in silence for hours, and it felt familiar, safe. One afternoon, as she reviewed data points on her screen, she looked up to find him watching her, not with pity, not with expectation, but with quiet admiration. Their eyes locked, and for the first time since her life crumbled, Celeste didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She let herself be seen again. And in that unspoken exchange, something fragile but real began to take root between them. The media continued to swarm around the fallout from Jason's empire, but Celeste was no longer hiding from it. When she was invited to speak, publicly, for the first time, at a private legal briefing for domestic abuse survivors, she hesitated. Mira encouraged her. Brandon promised he'd be in the front row. So, she went. The room wasn't large, but the eyes that met hers were filled with the same silent questions she once held. Will I survive this? Will I matter again? Celeste stood with her cane in hand, not to lean on, but to remind herself of how far she had come. I'm not a speaker, she began, and I won't pretend I'm whole. But I will tell you this, sometimes, surviving isn't enough. Sometimes you have to run. Not from something, but toward who you're meant to become. The applause was quiet, but it was genuine. After the event, a woman approached her in tears. You gave me hope, she said. Celeste nodded, blinking back her own. Because she wasn't running just for herself anymore. She was running for every woman who had been knocked down, told she was worthless, pushed to the floor and left there. She was proof that standing again was only the beginning. Jason Whitaker's arrest didn't happen in a back alley or under cover of night. It happened in the most humiliating place possible, just outside the courthouse where he had gone, ironically, to consult his attorney about damage control. The timing was brutal. He had just finished buttoning his suit jacket when two federal agents approached, read him his rights, and snapped cold silver cuffs around his wrists while cameras clicked like gunfire. His face went pale as he instinctively looked around for someone to save him, but there was no Naomi, no PR team, no fans to rally. The courtroom steps, once a stage where he had posed triumphantly during legal seminars, now became a gauntlet of shame. Reporters shoved microphones at him, shouting, "Jason, is it true you falsified investor returns? What do you say to the women you scammed? Did you silence your ex-wife with financial manipulation?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth moved, but no words came. When the footage aired on the evening news, Mira watched with a stoic expression while Celeste, seated beside her, merely whispered, "He finally knows what helpless feels like." Across town, Brandon received a phone alert from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission confirming Jason's accounts had been frozen, his licenses revoked, and several high-profile brands had filed civil suits. Jason Whitaker, once a golden icon of finance, was now just a man in a gray jumpsuit behind cold bars and colder truths. Naomi Cruz's reckoning came not with handcuffs, but with silence. Her name had become a stain, her face plastered on every digital tabloid headline, mistress turned mastermind, Naomi Cruz and the Empire of Deceit. She had attempted to vanish, first into the arms of a Dubai investor who turned her away at customs, then through a fake identity uncovered at LAX. Caught red-handed with 2 duffel bags of untraceable cash, Naomi had pleaded, cried, even faked a panic attack. It didn't work. She was detained, charged with conspiracy, fraud, and interference in an open abuse investigation. But more painful than her legal consequences was the abandonment. Jason stopped accepting her calls. Her influencer friends deleted every picture they had with her. Brands she had once bragged about cut ties overnight. Her social media was shut down after thousands of users flagged it for harmful conduct. And in the echo chamber of a holding cell, Naomi realized something terrifying. She had become invisible. No audience. No applause. No empire. Just her, stripped of artifice, watching the life she built on manipulation burn to ashes. In a bitter twist, it was a woman she barely remembered, Nina Foster, who had lit the first match. And Naomi would never see her coming. When Mira finally met Nina, it wasn't in a boardroom or a courtroom, it was at a quiet cafe, 2 weeks after the arrests. The meeting was arranged by Brandon, who knew both women deserved more than a thank you. They deserved to look one another in the eye and recognize the power they had shared in tearing down a monster. Mira arrived first, poised, polished, protective as always. Nina, dressed simply in jeans and a charcoal hoodie, walked incautiously but with purpose. They exchanged pleasantries, then sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything unspoken hanging thick in the air. Then Nina reached into her bag and placed a small flash drive on the table. "I kept backups," she said, "in case they try to rewrite the story later." Mira nodded, eyes full of respect. "You did more than you know," she said. "Celeste's life, my best friend's future, is different because of you." Nina looked away, her voice low. "I didn't do it for her. Not at first. I did it because watching Naomi destroy people reminded me of my own mother." Myra's expression softened, her own scars flickering just beneath the surface. They didn't need to share details. Some women speak volumes through shared silence. By the time they left the cafe, there were no photos, no handshakes, no spectacle. Just 2 women walking in opposite directions, having closed a chapter of war. And in the distance, far away from the noise of courtrooms and media frenzy, Celeste stood on a trail near the ocean, wind lifting her hair, running with both feet on solid ground. She wasn't watching Jason fall anymore. She was running toward everything she still had left to rise into. Brandon Sharp had never been a man of flamboyance or noise. He preferred the quiet corners of labs, the soft hum of processors, the comfort of certainty found in code. But there was one area of his life that had never followed logic: Celeste Whitaker. For years, he had worked beside her in the research lab, watching her brilliance shine like a lighthouse in a sea of mediocrity. She didn't just solve problems, she humanized them. She spoke to machines the way poets speak to paper. And while everyone else saw her as just another software genius, Brandon saw something else: her depth, her heartbreaks she never voiced, the fatigue behind her eyes when she stayed too long at work, the way she always apologized for taking up space. He fell in love quietly. Never confessed. Never interfered. And then one day, Jason appeared. Loud, magnetic, everything Brandon wasn't. He watched as Celeste was swept into a whirlwind romance and didn't say a word. If she's happy, he had told himself, that's enough. But when the light began to fade from her eyes, Brandon knew. Knew she had chosen wrong. Knew Jason didn't deserve her. Still, he remained in the shadows, supporting her projects, recommending her work for grants, even when she no longer spoke his name. And when he heard about her stroke, he dropped everything. They sat across from each other in the lab's private testing room now, the one Brandon had secured just for her recovery sessions and prototype development. The room was quiet except for the soft clicking of a keyboard and the low buzz of an artificial neural interface. Celeste had asked him to meet that day to discuss integrating her AI language comprehension model into the new recovery software they were developing. But Brandon knew he couldn't keep hiding the truth. Not after all they had been through. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, breaking the silence. Celeste looked up from the screen, her eyes steady. "Years ago, when we worked on the BlTCH project together, he stopped, exhaled, ran a hand through his hair. "I was in love with you. I still am. I didn't say anything because I thought you'd be happier with him." The room was still. Celeste's eyes softened, not with pity, but understanding. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because it was never about getting something from you," he replied. "It was about giving you the space to choose. And I thought you already had." Celeste stood slowly, walking toward him with cautious steps, not out of weakness, but emotional gravity. "And now?" she asked. Brandon looked her in the eye. "Now, I just want to walk beside you. However far you'll let me." Celeste didn't answer with words. She reached for his hand and held it, lightly at first, then with the certainty of someone choosing differently this time. There was no rush. No grand declaration. Just a shared moment of peace, two souls no longer running from truth. They sat together and began working again, shoulder to shoulder, not as saviors or survivors, but as equals building something greater than what either could do alone. Later that evening, as they walked out of the lab beneath the violet hues of dusk, Celeste turned to Brandon and asked, "If we had met in another life, do you think I would have chosen you?" Brandon smiled, but his eyes were serious. "You don't need another life to choose me, Celeste. You just need this one." She didn't respond right away, but as they reached the car, she paused, then leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. And just like that, the wall she had built around herself began to fall, not all at once, but in quiet, crumbling pieces. She wasn't ready for everything. But she was ready for something. Trust. Warmth. Maybe even love. And for the first time since her world fell apart, she allowed herself to believe she deserved all three. The keys felt strange in her palm, new, silver, and warm from sunlight. Celeste stood at the threshold of the Ocean View home nestled on the Monterey coast, surrounded by wildflowers, windswept trees, and the quiet hush of waves lapping at the rocky shore. This wasn't the kind of house Jason would have approved of, too simple, too unbranded. It didn't have the sterile luxury of the penthouse or the sharp-edged decor of performance living. No, this house was built for healing. For solitude. For beginning again. She had chosen it herself, no consultations, no staged Instagram walkthroughs, just intuition. The walls were cream-colored, the floors natural wood, and the windows stretched wide and tall, inviting in light like a promise. Mira helped her move in, bringing boxes labeled memories and things that matter. Brandon carried the heavier items, careful with every framed photo and book, as if touching pieces of her life required reverence. There was no big moving party, no celebratory champagne. Only a shared, sacred silence as they unpacked the fragments of a woman who had been broken, buried, and still somehow bloomed again. In the kitchen, Mira found an old mug with the words "I am still rising" etched in fading gold. She placed it on the windowsill without saying a word. That night, for the first time in nearly a year, Celeste slept in a bed that was entirely her own. In the days that followed, Celeste established a quiet rhythm that felt more like a heartbeat than a schedule. She rose early, not to impress or produce, but to walk barefoot across the cool wooden floor and make her tea while the morning fog painted everything in silver. She jogged gently along the coastal path, her strength returning in small, beautiful increments. Sometimes Brandon joined her, keeping pace but never leading, and other times she ran alone, testing her body, reclaiming her breath, choosing herself with every step. She began working again, not for profit or praise, but for purpose. Her AI software was nearing its final phase, a voice-adaptive communication module for stroke survivors. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, once silenced by trauma, was now helping others speak. When she sent her first prototype to trial, her inbox flooded with responses from therapists and patients who felt seen, heard, empowered. It was quiet success, no flashy awards or front-page spreads, but it filled her in ways Jason's applause never had. In the evenings, she sat on the porch with a blanket draped around her shoulders, watching the horizon stretch infinitely before her. The wind whispered through the cypress trees, and sometimes she whispered back, "Thank you for not letting me stay buried." One weekend, Dennis Whitaker drove up with his 2 daughters to visit, bringing laughter and the soft chaos of children's joy. He hugged Celeste with genuine affection, telling her she'd always be family regardless of what his brother had done. Mira visited often too, bringing her favorite almond croissants and teasing her about the way Brandon looked at her when he thought no one was watching. And Brandon, he had become something steady, something sure. He never pressed, never presumed. He came with groceries, with playlists he thought she'd like, with hands that built her a reading nook by the window just because she once mentioned missing one. One evening, they sat side by side on the porch, wrapped in silence and sunset. Celeste turned to him, her voice quiet but firm. "This is the first place that's ever felt like mine," she said. Brandon smiled. "That's because it is." He reached for her hand, not in pursuit, but in partnership, and she let him. No promises. No rushing. Just 2 people who had survived enough to know the value of peace. And as the stars blinked into the darkening sky above her new home, Celeste leaned back and exhaled, feeling something she hadn't dared to feel in months. Not just relief. Not even happiness. But safety. And that, more than anything, was her truest victory yet. The letter arrived without a return address, wrapped in crisp ivory paper, but Celeste knew the handwriting the moment she saw it. Jason's. She stared at it for a long time, not because she debated reading it, but because she debated whether to even let its presence occupy her new sanctuary. Mira was the one who finally opened it, scanning through the contents while sitting across from Celeste at the kitchen island. When she finished, she passed it over wordlessly. Jason's words were predictably hollow, filled with remorse soaked in self-preservation. He apologized for not being the man I promised to be, for letting ambition blind me, and most disgustingly, for not protecting you when you were at your weakest. The letter ended with a plea, "I hope one day you can forgive me. I'd like to see you, if you're willing. Even if just to say goodbye." Celeste folded the paper and placed it in a drawer. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked down to the cliffside near her house and sat with the ocean roaring beneath her. The wind tangled her curls, and for a moment, she was back on the floor of their old mansion, hearing him shout, "Just get lost already." She didn't cry. She didn't shatter. She simply stared into the endless blue and whispered, "I already did." Despite Myra's protests, Celeste agreed to meet Jason once, on her own terms, in a public cafe with no cameras, no spectacle. When she arrived, he was already there, thinner, paler, eyes weighted with something that looked like shame, but Celeste couldn't be sure if it was genuine or just the emptiness of losing everything. He stood up as she approached, reaching as if to hug her, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Let's not pretend," she said calmly, sitting across from him. The silence was thick, but Celeste let it sit. Let him squirm. Jason eventually broke it with the kind of fragility she never saw when he had power. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to say it. I ruined everything." "You didn't deserve," "You're right," Celeste cut in, her voice level. "I didn't." Jason looked away, blinking fast. Naomi's gone. My career. It's over. But you were the one real thing in my life, and I lost it. Celeste leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. You didn't lose me, Jason. You discarded me. There's a difference. He winced. So, you hate me? She took a slow sip of her tea. No. Hating you would mean I'm still carrying you. I let go a long time ago. Her words didn't rise in volume, but they landed like hammer strikes. Jason slumped back, defeated. The conversation ended without hugs, without healing. And as Celeste stood to leave, she looked over her shoulder and said, "Forgiveness has a price. And you can't afford mine." That night, Celeste returned home to the sound of Brandon's laughter echoing from the garden, where he was helping Myra's nephew build a fire pit. She stepped onto the porch and watched them, three people who had no idea what kind of storm she had just faced again, and yet still chose joy. Brandon looked up, his expression softening when their eyes met. "Everything okay?" he asked. Celeste nodded. "It's over," she said, and for the first time, she meant it completely. They sat together under the stars, and Celeste told him everything, about the letter, the meeting, the goodbye that was never really needed. "I don't want to carry any more of that," she said. "I want to build something new." Brandon squeezed her hand. "We already are." And in that simple sentence, Celeste realized how far she'd come. She no longer needed to win against Jason or outshine Naomi's cruelty. She didn't need vindication. She had peace, truth, and a life carved from scars and grace. As the flames from the fire pit flickered across her face, she smiled, not because it was easy, but because it was finally hers. And this time, she would never let anyone steal it again. The sun rose over the Monterey coast like a slow-burning promise, spilling gold across the cliffs and filling Celeste's living room with light that felt earned. Her home was quiet, not the silence of loneliness, but of peace. Every object had a place now. The books on her shelf were hers, chosen without judgment. The curtains swayed softly in the breeze she loved to let in. The rhythm of the ocean outside matched the steadiness of her breath, something she had reclaimed one inhale at a time. That morning, she woke early, laced her running shoes without hesitation, and stepped out into the cool dawn air. Her muscles responded with surprising ease. No cane. No limp. Just movement. Just her. The trail curved along the cliff's edge, and she ran it like it was a hymn to her own survival. No longer was she running away from pain or toward approval. She was running because she could. Her limbs moved in sync with the beat of her own heartbeat, and when she stopped at the ridge to catch her breath, she looked out at the water and whispered, "Thank you." Not to the ocean. Not to the sky. But to herself, for not giving up when it would have been easier. For choosing herself even after others didn't. Later that afternoon, the garden behind her house buzzed with quiet joy. Mira sat with a sketchpad in her lap, humming a soft tune as she mapped out plans for a flower bed. Dennis leaned against the back porch railing, sipping lemonade while his daughters chased butterflies across the lawn. Brandon had just returned from the hardware store, grinning as he unpacked the wooden swing kit Celeste had offhandedly mentioned wanting weeks ago. "You remembered," she said, her voice soft. "Of course I did," he answered, handing her the instructions. Together, they built it, slowly, with laughter and a few missteps, but without pressure. It was in the small acts that Celeste found healing, in the way Mira braided her hair one evening, the way Dennis offered to co-fund a recovery foundation in her name without making her a spokesperson, the way Brandon always let her choose her own pace. He never tried to own her victory, he just witnessed it. When the swing was finally assembled, she sat on it and rocked gently, the motion steady and free. "So, what now?" Brandon asked, sitting beside her. Celeste smiled, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "Now, we live," she said. Without waiting for the next disaster. Without letting the past steal another second. As evening fell, they gathered under soft lights strung across the patio, Mira, Brandon, Dennis, the girls, eating grilled vegetables and laughing at old stories. Celeste listened more than she spoke, letting the sound of joy soak into her bones. When it was time for farewells, Mira hugged her tightly and whispered, "I'm proud of you. Not because you survived, but because you chose to live after." Brandon stayed behind, helping clean up. When the last dish was done, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small box, not a ring, but a pendant. Inside was a tiny engraved charm that read, "Whole." "You don't need anything from anyone to be complete," he said. "But I hope you wear this as a reminder that you already are." Celeste held it in her palm and smiled. "I'll wear it every time I forget." That night, as the house settled and the stars stitched themselves across the sky, Celeste climbed into bed and pulled the sheets over her shoulder. She wasn't afraid to dream anymore. Her past had burned down around her, but from its ashes, she had built something better. Stronger. Hers. Not a new chapter. A new book. And as she drifted into sleep, peaceful and whole, her final thought was not of Jason, Naomi, or pain, it was of tomorrow. And for the first time in a long time, she couldn't wait to meet it. The end.